What are the brain benefits of nature exposure? That's exactly what we're going to explore in this episode of Get the Stuck Out. Well, hello again. This is Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and welcome to the Get the Stuck Out podcast. This is the podcast where we explore what is keeping our brains and our bodies stuck and what to do to get this stuck out. One of the areas I've been talking about a lot over the course of the last several years is the connection between nature exposure and better health. My dad and I discussed this at length in our book Brainwash, and if you follow me on social media, you'll be aware that I post about nature, or vitamin N, a whole lot. Nature exposure has been linked to improvements in immune function, better cardiovascular health, improved recovery after illness, and even may help lower the risk of dying early. When it comes specifically to brain function, nature has been linked to lowered stress, improved mental health, enhanced cognitive abilities, and may even influence the way that we perceive those around us. So, lots of interesting stuff to discuss in today's episode. This episode of Get the Stuck Out is all about the ways in which nature exposure may improve our health. We're going to focus then more specifically on how nature may improve our brain health. We're going to talk about what the science has shown us to date on this subject and what you can do to start benefiting from nature's effects on your brain starting today. Before we get started with the meat of the podcast, just a reminder that this is for general information. It's not a substitute for medical advice, and you should always discuss with your healthcare provider prior to making any major changes to your health plan. Okay, let's go ahead and get this stuck out. A survey conducted a few years back looked at how modern day humans are spending their time. They specifically looked at American adults and they asked them how much of their day was spent inside versus outside. The surprising results of this survey found that in a typical day, we are either indoors or in our vehicles 93% of the time. That leaves only 7% of our day outside. Additionally, it's widely known that humans have migrated from more rural centers to more urban centers, and it's thought by the year 2050, 70% of people will live in cities. Now, I know there are a whole lot of reasons why it's helpful to be inside and why living in an urban center may be preferable to living out in the middle of nowhere. I'm doing this podcast from the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, not a cabin in the wilderness. Yet there are two important points that I think I need to make here. First, we may be losing something really key to our health by our separation with nature. And second, there may be ways to get much of this back that don't require us to completely give up on our urban lives. Let's start the conversation around the potential health value of nature with recognizing an important fact. Nature exposure could either help our wellness by directly improving our physiology or by the fact that it is a substitute for the unhealthy things that we tend to do when we're not in nature, like watching TV for hours or gorging on junk food or social media scrolling. So nature exposure may be, by its nature, just less stressful, less inflammatory exposure than what we're getting when we stay in our typical day-to-day lives. And both are relevant points, both the direct effects of nature on our health and perhaps the more indirect effects by way of substituting out what is a relatively unhealthy effect of our urban day-to-day lives. So let's start by looking at the pathway that connects our urban exposure with worse health and how nature, just by virtue of being a substitute, may be beneficial. In the modern day, we spend an absurd amount of our time interacting with digital media. In fact, the average American adult is spending about 11 hours a day interacting with media, and that includes around 4 hours of the day just watching TV. We're spending hours of our day on social media, and I think it's clear that in addition to the media we consume, our jobs, our relationships, all of this can be incredibly stressful. Recent studies have shown that rates of psychological stress are very high, and in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, they only appear to have worsened. Depression and anxiety have also been linked, especially in youth, to excessive use of things like social media as well as TV programming that highlights social comparison. Cities, which tend to be filled with loud noises and potentially poor air quality, may keep our sympathetic nervous system in a state of constant activation, fueling stress and anxiety, in addition to by other pathways that we'll describe, fueling the potential higher risk for cardiovascular and other types of diseases. So, with all of this in mind, It makes a lot of sense that simply unplugging from the hectic, stressful, and otherwise quite unhealthy environment of our typical lives would have health benefits. This helps to explain how practices like mindfulness and meditation can have significant effects on brain related processes like cognition and mood. Simply giving ourselves a break from the default state of things is already a substantial positive intervention. In this vein, it has been proposed that some of the benefit gleaned from getting out into nature is simply the benefit that comes from getting out of the usual day to day madness of the modern world. Let's discuss a few ways in which this would connect to our health and especially would connect to our brain health. First, as previously noted, the modern day and our urban environments can be very activating to our sympathetic nervous system and to our stress response. Chronic activation of the stress response and the sympathetic nervous system have been linked to a whole lot of poor health states. As it relates to brain function, this chronic activation has been linked to higher risk for cognitive decline. From a neuroanatomical perspective, a few areas in the brain appear to be especially sensitive to the effects of chronic stress. These include the hippocampus, which is a memory hub in the brain, as well as the amygdala, an emotional hub, and then finally the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain which is tasked with making higher level decisions and problem solving. It's thought that when the brain is basically left bathing in this soup of excess stress and high cortisol, it can damage the neurons in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, while it could actually strengthen the neurons in the amygdala. This could bias us towards more reactive types of thinking and less regulation over our emotions, and may contribute to worse decisions and generally more trouble thinking clearly. Another pathway worth considering is immune activation. And as you've heard me discuss before, the state of our immune health appears to play a large role in determining the state of our brain health. More specifically, it's thought that an imbalanced immune system that favors chronic inflammation may be especially damaging to multiple aspects of our brain health, including contributing to worse cognition. So what's the connection here to urban environments and inflammation? First, chronic stress itself seems to foster inflammation. So all the things I just discussed regarding chronic stress and activation of the stress pathway are directly relevant to this immunity conversation. Next, air pollution appears to induce inflammation, and it's actually thought to be a trigger of certain conditions like Alzheimer's disease, meaning it may contribute to cognitive decline. There's also really interesting data suggesting that air pollution exposure might bias our thinking in such a way that we make more impulsive and potentially even more violent choices. For more on this, check out an article I wrote called How Air Pollution Changes Our Decisions on Psychology Today. I'll also include that in the show notes. There's also the consideration for the idea that many of us city livers spend our days sitting in front of our computers rather than moving around. The absence of movement has been connected with higher levels of inflammation. Lastly, while the overall diet quality of people across the world has really suffered tremendously in the last 100 or so years, we may be more likely to grab readily available processed food when we're working hard and when we're stressed. Ultra-processed foods, like the ones that are found in fast food restaurants, snack machines, and other convenient quick locations, may boost chronic inflammation in the brain as well as the body. For the reasons I just described, basically anything that isn't the usual day-to-day of urban life may in and of itself be beneficial to our physical and to our brain health. So is this all that's going on when it comes to the benefits of nature? Is it really just about doing something other than what we usually do? I don't think so. So let's jump into some really interesting research that I believe shows why there's so much more to this picture. In around the 1980s, researchers in Japan started investigating something called Shinrinyoku, and this translates into forest bathing. The idea behind this research was pretty simple. It was to explore whether there are health benefits to simply being in nature. And in the decades since, we've learned so much about the different pathways by which nature exposure appears to improve our health. In this part of the podcast, I'll explore some of the more consistent changes seen in the research with nature exposure as it relates to various aspects of our health, including stress and the immune system, as well as some of the interesting research related to the brain, including cognition and behavior studies that have been done with nature exposure. So let's return to the stress pathways that seem to be revved up in the modern day. Getting into nature appears to dampen these overactive pathways, lowering activation of the sympathetic nervous system and ramping up activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. In a 2011 paper examining the results of 24 different experiments, it was concluded that as little as 15 minutes of nature viewing or walking in nature was associated with a decrease in levels of cortisol in the saliva, as well as lowered blood pressure, lowered heart rate, and higher heart rate variability. And these are the last several I mentioned are markers of increases in parasympathetic tone and decreased activation of stress pathways. But is it just that we're getting out of stressful urban environments? Well, some research shows that even ornamental plants in hospital rooms were associated with lower systolic blood pressure and decreased anxiety. This suggests there's more to the picture. Some other research looked specifically at the effect of inhaling phytoncides. These are aromatic oils that are found in woods. In some research, it's been shown that people who were exposed to phytoncides from the Japanese cedar were having evidence of decreased blood pressure as well as other decreases in markers of sympathetic activation. Similarly, exposure to an oil found in pine trees was shown to increase heart rate variability, which again is a surrogate for parasympathetic activity, and in this study it increased heart rate variability by 46%. Another study found that even 20 minutes of urban nature exposure led to a significant drop in the level of cortisol found in the saliva of volunteers. Overall, these types of data showed that nature exposure, even in versions far less than complete nature immersion, appear to have a positive effect on stress pathways. Now let's turn back to the immune system, which, as you'll remember, is a major factor in our overall health and the health of our brains. Multiple studies have shown correlations between decreased inflammation and nature exposure. Perhaps most notably, nature seemed to support an increase in the function of what are called natural killer cells with nature exposure. Natural killer cells are a unique immune cell subtype with a variety of functions that include killing tumor and virus-infected cells. Some research suggests that exposure to nature-rich environments might enhance the NK or natural killer cell response. Now, I want to be cautious here because this research doesn't indicate that simply going outside is going to majorly alter your immune health, but it is certainly interesting to consider that our immune systems are largely programmed by our environmental exposures, and that for hundreds of thousands of years, our immunity was taking its cues from nature, not from the artificial foods and artificial environments that we now live in. While the exact mechanisms and the effects of nature on the immune system are still being studied, one recent systematic review pointed to positive effects of nature exposure on immunity by way of anti-allergy effects, anti-asthma effects, decreased inflammation, and increased natural killer cell activity. Although it did qualify this with the statement that some weaker study designs and other factors call into question the specifics of reproducibility and other variables. Okay, so now let's turn to the fun stuff. How might nature influence our psychological state, our cognition, even the way that we engage with and see other people? This is where we start to get to some really fascinating research. Let's start with how nature may change the way that we see others. In an experiment published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2014, Dr. Paul Piff and his colleagues split a group of 90 undergraduates in two groups. One group looked up at a stand of tall eucalyptus trees for 1 minute, and then the other group spent a minute looking up at tall buildings in the opposite direction. After they had either viewed the trees or the building, the participants were asked to complete several tasks. One of these tasks had an experimenter requesting assistance from the two groups of participants. What the researchers found is that the group who had looked at the trees were significantly more likely to help out the experimenter requesting assistance. This implies that nature exposure may actually help to enhance empathy for other people. And there's more research on this subject as well. Another study was published in a journal called Computers and Human Behavior back in 2014. In this study, researchers sent preteens into the woods to stay at a nature camp where their phones and their other screens were taken away. And they tested them on how well they could pick up emotional cues both prior to and at the end of the 5-day period. Compared to age-matched kids who stayed in town and were allowed to use their screens, the children in the woods showed a significant improvement in their ability to pick up on nonverbal communication. So the point in this type of research seems to be that nature may enhance our empathy and our desire to help other people, our ability to connect with others. So, how might nature improve the way that we make choices? There's an interesting concept in the literature called attention restoration theory. It basically states that people can concentrate better after spending time engaging with nature. Nature's restorative effect on our focus has actually been tested in several studies, and though there's some heterogeneity in these results, a recent systematic review published in 2018 concluded that working memory, cognitive flexibility, and to a less reliable degree, attentional control are improved after exposure to natural environments with low to moderate effect sizes, but with perhaps higher potential for people to experience this enhancement when natural environments are real rather than virtual. And this is a good moment to make an interesting observation. Many of the studies that look at the effects of nature exposure on brain function actually use virtual natural environments, and still many of them find a positive effect. Another thing to consider on the subject specifically of focus is that when you look at children who have ADHD, there's actually some research suggesting that nature exposure has a positive effect on their focus. Let's go a little bit more specifically into choices. So another effect of nature exposure on brain function seems to be that it may help us to make better choices. In a study of Americans published in a journal PLOS One, it was found that not only did more access to and exposure to nature predict better mood, but having more accessible nature predicted less impulsive decision-making. Another study published in the same journal looked at whether exposure to virtual pictures of nature versus cityscapes would significantly influence decision-making. It found that people who looked at nature made significantly less impulsive decisions than those who looked at city scenes. And there are other interesting observations, like the fact that, for example, nature exposure may help to improve creativity. Okay, well, with all that said, let's go ahead and do a recap. Nature exposure appears to be overall on the decline. It used to be the default, and now it's a rarity. Nature time has been associated with decreased stress, with better overall mental health and better physical health metrics as well. When it comes to mechanisms linking nature with our physiology, it appears that nature preferentially influences stress pathways and potentially positively influences our immune system. When it comes to how the brain is changed by nature, we may become a bit more empathetic and a bit more creative as the result of this vitamin N. We may also have better focus and even make better choices. All of this in the context of an intervention that can often be free and almost always be cheap is, I think, reason alone to think about nature as a viable tool to improve our health. So in the last few minutes of this podcast, let's address two questions. First, how much nature do you actually need to get health benefits? I wrote an article on this subject called How to Dose Vitamin N, which you can find on Psychology Today. I'll also again include this link in the show notes. The basic idea here is that we're not exactly sure, but it's likely that you start getting some of the benefits at around 15 to 20 minutes in nature, although if you can get more, go for it. The second question is, how do we go about getting that bit more vitamin N in our day? I found that here it's helpful to ask friends and family, especially those that live locally, because they may have some knowledge about things that are local. Generally speaking, however, here are a couple of ideas. First, consider finding a forest, a park, or even just some urban trees. Bring lunch, a book, take a walk, or just sit there and enjoy the nature. You can try purchasing and caring for an indoor plant. However, if you do decide to do this and you haven't had experience, I highly recommend you start with something that is easier to care for, like a snake plant. You could consider starting a windowsill garden to grow something that you can eat. You could also look into a community garden in your area and participate in growing foods that you could eat there. You could check out hipcamprecreation.gov or other ways to book a way to camp or glamp in the woods. And then finally, you can look for meetup groups focused on getting outside that are based in your area. These, of course, are just a few ideas. And if you have other ideas, which I'm sure you do, I would love to hear from you. So you can drop a comment if you're watching this on video, or drop a comment or message me on social media as it relates to this episode. Okay, well, that's it for this episode of Get the Stuck Out. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and leave a review. Until next time, I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and this is Get the Stuck Out.